So we want employees to be motivated. And for the last number of years, we've talked about that in the context of engagement. But I'm really interested in digging into what motivation is. That's coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams. This is the HR Hub, and on this show, we talk about anything related to HR. Please subscribe to the show or to the podcast to keep learning from my guests. So today, my guest is Dr. Roger Gerard. Roger's a speaker, author, and executive coach. He spent years in healthcare trying to motivate employees and then create systems that were motivating for employees. He was chief learning officer at a healthcare organization in Wisconsin for 23 years. And he recently wrote a book called Lead with Purpose. Hi, Roger. How are you?
Well, hello. How are you, Andrea?
I'm good and looking forward to this. I remember talking a lot about motivation when I was studying in school, like a long time ago, my business degree. And then almost we haven't talked about it since. So I'm interested in the topic. From your perspective, like just to get us started off, what is motivation?
Wow, that's right to the core, right away. I love the concept and I love the topic for a couple of reasons. There's a lot of mythology around motivation in the
Yes.
leadership and management training schools today.
Yes.
When I first learned the basic content of supervisory management and leadership development, that's way back in the 70s and 80s. The mantra was the role of leaders is to plan, organize, and control. And
Oh,
there wasn't a lot of conversation about motivation, although a lot of the psychological literature was starting to generate research and understandings around motivation. Maslow came along with his hierarchy of needs, and we ended up with grid leadership and management. We had situational leadership and management. And the idea of motivation became something that was very ambiguous and kind of a black hole. We would talk about leaders' role in managing motivation, but nobody knew what the hell that meant. Today, I've come to the conclusion that it is not leaders' job to motivate people. So that's the starting point.
oh,
And, and that's counterintuitive for a lot of people in leadership. I don't get up on Monday morning waiting for somebody to motivate me. I know what I want to do with my day, with my time, with my life, with my family, with the things that I do every day. And I know what I want to do with my work. Nobody has to motivate me for any of that. I motivate myself, and I believe that's true of most professionals. What leaders do is we mess it up, and that to me is at the heart of my book, Lead with Purpose. We
mhm.
spend a lot of time interfering with the natural processes that professionals bring to their work. What our job is to cultivate the motivation that's already there and bring
Ah,
and bring that motivation in alignment with the purposes of the organization. That's our job. And very often the tactics we use and the strategies we employ to make that happen are more dampening to the idea of motivation than they are encouraging and inspiring.
motivation as a concept, it kind of seemed to, like you say, like in the 70s or whatever. I mean, not relevant to me, but it was on its way up. Like it wasn't talked about at that time. Then I think somewhere in like maybe the 80s and 90s, it started getting talked about a lot. And now it seems to have fallen out of favor.
Sure.
Like, why is that? Do you know?
The shift has been from motivation to engagement, which I
Okay.
think is probably a healthy shift. A lot of that came because a number of organizations like Gallup and the Conference Board and others
Mm,
started to do very rigorous research in whether people were really engaged in their work or not. And Gallup for the last 25 years has basically said, you know what? They're not. Um,
yes, I know.
Roughly 30% of the employee population in this country are engaged. The other 60, 70%, About half of them are kind of on the fence, doing their time, and about the other half of that 60%, they're disengaged. They don't want to
Yeah.
be here, and they have no plans to leave. That's a problem. And
Yeah, that is a
so,
problem.
Gallup, among others, is raising the flag and saying, we're not doing this well. We're not doing this properly.
Yeah.
And I agree with them.
Yeah.
They're absolutely right.
When I was in school, we talked a lot about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I think you and I are going to get there. But what's the difference between those two? Remind us.
Intrinsic means it's coming from within.
Yeah.
If I'm motivated on Monday morning, it's coming from within me. It's not
Hmm.
because somebody else has dangled a carrot in front of me and hope that I reach for the carrot. That's not how I do things.
Hmm.
That's not what wakes me up in the morning and gives me joy. Um, Extrinsic is that carrot. Extrinsic is when we put
Mm.
something out in front of somebody and say, if you do this, you get that. And that there are a thousand ways to create extrinsic reward systems. They're all over the map in business and industry today. They have very different results when you try to create an environment of engagement. Very different results.
Um, so compensation would be an extrinsic motivator, but fundamentally, I mean, it is motivating because that's why we show up to work. We have to put food on the table.
Let's talk about compensation first because it's at the center of a lot of corporate thinking. People think that if you pay somebody, then they ought to go do the job.
And they ought to go do the job enthusiastically.
Well, yeah, but see that's the second part of it that it's not well understood that doesn't work that way. Um, what happens is money is a proxy. It's a proxy. And you just mentioned part of that proxy when you said, well, we got to put food on the table. We got to take care of our families. We have a baby in the house, and that baby is going to need support. We've got parents that are aging, and we need to help our parents. See, it's not the money. The money is fuel to get other things done. And if we start to understand the meaning behind what we're doing, then we can try to get at what's really causing these people to take this job in the first place and what causes them to find meaning in that job. That requires that you get a profound understanding of the people you're working with. Do you really know who they are? And do you
Hmm.
really know why they are there? If you don't know the answer to those questions, money is just a transaction.
Hmm.
It's just something that everybody assumes is going to create an outcome. But you said it a minute ago, you can't cause people to care with money. That's not going to happen.
And yet you can cause people not to care if you don't pay them the right amount.
Absolutely. If you go back to the studies done by McGregor and Herzberg back in the 50s and 60s, they talked about hygiene factors versus motivators. And
Mm.
hygiene factors were things like work environment and safety and cleanliness and so on. And the motivators were things like inspiration and recognition and that kind of stuff. And the question at the time, if you go back and read the literature in the 50s, where does money fall? And Herzberg put money on the hygiene factor side. It's a
Hmm.
hygiene factor. You got to have it in order to stay competitive as a business. You got to pay it, but don't expect it to motivate people.
Hmm. Yeah.
What it does is it satisfies people to a point, but satisfaction is not motivation.
So we're going to get to the heart of the matter, which I think everybody's curious about. So we want intrinsic motivation. We have to satisfy that basic extrinsic motivators like compensation. You know, if you pay someone $10 an hour for a job, when everybody else is getting $30 an hour, they're going to be unsatisfied. But what's a leader's job around the intrinsic motivation?
Yeah. Um, Let's talk about the relationship between leaders and the people who they are leading, because that's where it starts. If you have a relationship with someone, that requires a couple of things. It requires that you expose yourself a little bit so that people
Mm-hmm.
know who you are. It
Mm-hmm.
requires that you solicit feedback on what you're doing so that people have some understanding, so that the leader has some understanding about how they are affecting the people they are leading. It
Mm-hmm.
requires that there be an ongoing exchange of that kind of information over time. And so where you find the most engaged people is when there are systems in place to allow a very, very profound level of dialogue between the leaders and the people doing the daily work. You have to be able to spend time in conversation. And a lot of leaders don't feel like they have the time. Well, they're wrong, because what happens is when they don't take the time is they take all kinds of other time fixing mistakes, fixing errors, repairing damaged relationships, and doing all kinds of things that they shouldn't have to do and wouldn't have had to do if they had had the relationship in the first place. It's about relationships. And so if you want to talk about at the core level, what are the behaviors that leaders have to exemplify? It starts with listening. It starts with being willing to listen, not just to know what the problems are and the concerns are, but to listen at a much more deep level about where are these people coming from in terms of their own needs, their own wants, their own intentions, and how can I help them be successful in accomplishing those things.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very, very different behavior than you see in many leaders.
Mm-hmm. They're worried so much about their own success
The metrics
and the metrics
and the metrics.
and the
Yes.
metrics.
I don't mean to discount metrics. We have to have them, but it's not the it. If we're going to talk about motivation, you have to be willing to create relationships, and the
Yeah.
metrics need to be shared metrics. That's the second point. If I come to a group of people and I say, "Well, we have to improve the bottom line by 5% and productivity by 6% over the next 12 months," that's a pretty specific metric. How much play did I give the professionals doing the daily work in the creation of that metric and in the strategy for achieving that metric? Or did I just impose it? And a lot of leadership today is an imposition process. We just impose these things on people instead
Yeah.
of saying, hey, what's possible? Let's talk about this. What are
Yeah.
the
So in healthcare organizations tend to be, there's lots of employees working shifts,
thousands?
and and a lot of times it is top down where uh, the leaders, they come up with, they've got all these external factors that they have to address, these threats. And I find a lot of times that employees, um, at the bottom, just totally being honest, don't appreciate those. They don't understand why X, Y, and Z are a threat to the organization, or it's a key opportunity. And when you've got an organization the size of like a healthcare organization with so many people, how do you avoid imposition?
Um, what you've just described has resulted over the decades in what I call the cynics, the apathetics, and the naysayers. This cast of characters are the people who have listened to what you just described, experienced what you just described, and they've checked out emotionally. I've seen it among physicians who are deeply demoralized today. I've seen
Mm-hmm.
it among nurses. I've seen it out of the other professions in the healthcare industry. I've seen it in teachers in the
Yes.
elementary and high school level teaching professions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of imposition going on that is not necessary. In one organization I consulted with a few years back, I convinced the CEO to let me have a free wheel in talking with employees throughout the organization. And she was golden. She was a marvelous CEO at the time. And I literally did 30 focus groups around the organization with thousands of people. And out of those 30 focus groups and a survey of 5,000 people, including 1,000 physicians, um, crafted an iteration of a mission statement for the organization, a vision statement for the organization over 5 years, a set of strategies and core values, and it had the signatures of literally thousands of people, the fingerprints of thousands of people on the document. What kind of power do you think that gave to the leaders?
Well, it sure must have been enabling, especially if they bought into it.
These employees were hypercharged. Nobody had ever asked them before. Nobody had ever come to them and asked, why are you here? What brings you energy? What
Mhm.
brings you intention? What brings you meaning? And how can we embed that in the description of why we are here as an organization? And when you do that, yes, it takes time. That took months to pull off. But when we had the documents and brought them back to staff, they said, yes, that's why we're here. Now, how do we live it? And that's where operational plans and daily activities start coming into play. And you got to train your managers and your supervisors and your leaders about what's in the document and the behaviors you expect of them as they work with their staff. You also have to have some boundaries. You have to say, look, cynicism has to stop.
Mhm.
Blame and shame has to stop. Um, all of the nonsense that about the suits in the organization has to stop.
Oh, the cynicism about leadership.
Yeah, all
As
that has to go. And if we find that it's going on, it's job threatening territory. It's no longer it's not who we are anymore. Um, and I've had the unfortunate or fortunate, depending on how you look at it, responsibility of helping as many people out of an organization as I have helping people into an organization. Sometimes it's the wrong fit. Okay, then you go forward. But you
Mhm.
need to surround yourself with people who are aligned with the energies of the organization and the intentions of the organization. That's,
In terms of setting up a situation so employees are motivated, what's the basics?
again, they already are. So that's the starting point. So what you do is you bring them together. I'm going to keep saying this, and it's going to feel trite. It's not. It comes from the conversations. Um,
Mm.
I formed in one organization I was working with. I formed what we called the communications committee. Basically, we ask every manager to assign one of their best employees to this duty for a year. And the meetings were bi-monthly for twice a month for 3 months, and then monthly after that for a year. And this communication committee was supposedly made up of their best. About 50 people in this one organization I was working on. And what we did is we went through a process of 1 day events every time we met. And in the morning, the events were leadership presenting their thoughts and ideas about the future and about the present and some of the issues they were facing and so on. In the afternoon, we put them to work with the leaders on what can we do about these things and how can we amplify them further and how can we spread these ideas through the rest of the organization so
Mm.
people understand what's going on. After a year of this, I asked people, do we want to continue this? The answer was an overwhelming yes. We want to continue this.
How do we make sure that we get the extrinsic motivators right so that they're not um, detracting
Yeah.
from motivation?
Let's start with money. That's the big one. And typically in the HR work, and I've been there, we go after surveys and we do salary studies and we do job evaluations and we try to
Hmm.
align the jobs up so that it's internally consistent and externally consistent with the marketplace. And we do all those studies, and then we assign pay scales, and the pay scales have ranges, and all of
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
it's all part of it. And then we make decisions about what people are going to be paid. And we claim that it's market competitive because we did the study and we're at the 50% compa ratio. Well, if that's what you're doing, you're probably already 6 to 12 months behind on the data. I haven't seen a salary survey coming out of the HR organizations that I used to belong to. I haven't seen one that's up to date yet.
No, well, they survey in the spring, they publish in the fall, and by the time you actually do something about it, it's almost the following spring. And so, yes.
It's dumb. I think that for base compensation, we ought to be telling people, look, we're going to pay you at the 60 to 65% compa ratio.
Mm-hmm.
Period. If you want to be competitive, that's where you got to be.
Mm-hmm.
People do see compensation not as a motivator. It's a message of value.
Oh,
That's what
yes.
we fail to understand.
Yes.
We fail to understand that if somebody is making less than their colleagues somewhere else, they don't feel valued. So from an HR standpoint, what really should we be doing? Now, the CEO is going to come to us and say, hey, we got to cut labor costs. We got to do something to bring this under control. I get it. But the minute you start sending messages to people that they're not valued, they're going to respond in kind. That's just how it is. Add to that the benefits. Now you're talking about all kinds of things, healthcare and
Yeah.
insurance and all this stuff, vacation
Retirement
time,
savings and
retirement, and it's all there. Most HR people do all this stuff, but then they don't monetize it in a way that makes sense for the staff. It's part of the compensation package, and people need to understand the value of those things and how it compares to the competition. And if you haven't done that work, and many haven't, the employees will never know what the value of their benefits are.
yeah,
And in many organizations, it's expensive. This is a big
it
value.
is expensive.
I
It's
would
very
say,
expensive.
I would say to your HR listeners, put a dollar sign on that. Figure out what the value of that is to your staff, and then find out what your competitors' benefits are and put a value on that and see how you compare.
Mm,
Again, compensation and benefits are a way we tell people how valued they are. It's
mhm.
not about putting food on the table anymore. You can do that by becoming unemployed. It's about whether I value you or not as a professional. That's the beginning. And then I see all these other incentive programs that are just downright dumb, putting people in competition with one another for certain
Oh,
prizes
yes,
and games
yes.
and so on. Downright dumb. Most employees look at that stuff over time as with a cynical eye. They're
Hmm.
just, once you go that way, it's not seen as motivation; it's seen as manipulation.
Mm.
And once people feel like they're being manipulated, they have two responses. One response is to walk away from it. The other is to manipulate back.
That was a wonderful conversation. That was great, so reinforcing. Where could someone learn more about this idea of motivation, and also where can they find you?
Well, we'll just use the same answer for both questions. Please go to my website, rogergerard.com. And on
Mhm.
my website, you'll find links to all of my blogs on LinkedIn. You'll find
Okay.
links to my books on Amazon. Um, and when you go out to Amazon, you'll find other materials out there. I've got 3 books out there, not just
Okay.
with purpose, but another one called Owning the Room, which was written precisely for some of the conversations that we're talking about today around
Okay.
the idea of the supervisory and management role in cultivating engagement. I would consider the 2 books as a first and a second chapter of leadership development, and that's why I wrote them. So,
okay, excellent. Inspirational. Well, thanks, Roger. I love that. I especially am thinking about the part around building deep connections, that leaders need to take the time to build deep connections, and that requires a little bit of, well, you didn't use the word vulnerability, but I'm using it now, like really revealing your personal self. And I had a conversation, really interesting one, with Israel Beck, and we talked about psychological safety and how to actually build it fast, which seems gimmicky, but it wasn't. It was all about those deep connections. So I encourage you to watch that. A link to that is right here. And thanks for watching out there. We'll see you next time.